I was clearing the dishes that evening when I felt his gaze on me. Intense, unspoken. "Can we talk?" my nephew whispered. His words, hesitant yet deliberate, shattered the calm. What he confessed next. I wasn't prepared for it. It wasn't just shocking, it was dangerous. And it all started in that kitchen, under the glow of dim lights. The weekend started like any other. A house full of laughter, the scent of fresh lasagna wafting from the kitchen, and my sister's family filling the rooms with energy. My nephew, Ethan, had grown so much since the awkward teen I once knew. Now 20, he carried himself with a confidence that always surprised me. We had a bond that wasn't just familial. It was deeper. He wasn't just my nephew. He was a friend, someone I could talk to about life, memories, and everything in between. That evening, we found ourselves in the kitchen after dinner. My sister Rachel and her husband were outside, their laughter blending with the chirp of crickets, while the kids played noisily upstairs. It was a peaceful, familiar moment, one that made me feel grounded. "You should teach Mom how to make this lasagna," Ethan teased, leaning casually against the counter with a grin. "Yours is so much better. Don't let her hear you say that." I chuckled, flicking him lightly with a towel. His smile was warm, a reflection of the boy I'd seen grow up before my eyes. We slipped into the easy rhythm of conversation, a reminder of the countless hours spent in each other's company over the years. Yet, as the night went on, something shifted. A subtle change in the way he looked at me, the way he hesitated before speaking. "You always know what to say, Aunt Claire," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight I couldn't quite place. "That's why I feel like I can talk to you about anything." I paused, rinsing the last dish and turning to face him. His blue eyes held something unspoken, an earnest vulnerability that tugged at my chest. "Of course," I said, keeping my voice steady. "You can always talk to me, Ethan." It was then that he sighed, his hand raking through his hair as he searched for the right words. "I've been feeling lost lately, like I don't know who I am or where I'm going. And you're the only one I feel safe telling this to." His confession caught me off guard. Ethan, the confident young man who always seemed so sure of himself, was struggling. And in that moment, I felt a protective surge, vowing to be the anchor he needed. In the days that followed, the moment in the kitchen lingered in my mind more than I cared to admit. Ethan's words were raw and vulnerable, and I couldn't shake the way his gaze had held mine, searching for reassurance. I told myself it was nothing, a fleeting moment of connection between a nephew and his aunt. But the way he acted around me afterward made me question if it truly was nothing. It began subtly. Ethan started volunteering to help with things he usually wouldn't, like washing dishes or tidying up after dinner. He'd linger in the kitchen longer than necessary, striking up conversations that felt deeper than the casual banter we'd always shared. And then there were his eyes, always watching, always attentive. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, we found ourselves alone in the living room. The house was quiet, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator in the background. I was curled up on the couch with a book, but I couldn't focus. My attention kept drifting to Ethan, who was seated on the floor with a sketchpad on his lap, his pencil moving methodically across the page. "You're really focused," I said, breaking the silence. He glanced up, a small smile playing on his lips. "Drawing helps me think," he replied, tilting the sketchpad to reveal a beautiful, intricate landscape. "It's how I process things." "It's amazing," I said genuinely, leaning forward to get a better look. "You've got real talent." "Thanks," he murmured, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my heart skip a beat. "I don't show this stuff to just anyone." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I tried to brush it off with a laugh. "Well, you shouldn't hide it. It's really good." He hesitated before speaking again, his tone quieter now. "Do you ever feel like you're just going through the motions?" I paused, his question catching me off guard. "Sometimes," I admitted. "Why do you ask?" He shrugged, his gaze dropping back to the sketchpad. "I don't know. Lately, I feel like I'm stuck. Like I'm living the life everyone expects of me. But it's not what I really want." His words struck a chord deep within me, echoing thoughts I'd buried long ago. "That's normal," I said softly. "Life pushes us in directions we don't always choose. But it's okay to take your time figuring out what you really want." Ethan nodded, his eyes meeting mine again. "That's what I like about you," he said quietly. "You get it. You always know the right thing to say." There was something in his tone, something vulnerable and raw, that made my chest tighten. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, we sat in silence, the air between us thick with an unspoken tension I couldn't quite name. The days that followed brought more of the same. Little moments that felt different. The way Ethan's hand lingered on mine when passing a dish. The way his laughter seemed louder and more genuine when I was the one cracking the joke. The way his gaze found mine across a crowded room and lingered just a second too long. I tried to push the thoughts away, to convince myself that I was imagining things. But the more I noticed, the harder it became to ignore. And with every passing day, the line between us seemed to blur just a little more. As the week wore on, I couldn't ignore the growing weight of the unspoken connection between Ethan and me. The air felt different when we were together, heavier, charged. It was nothing overt, nothing anyone else would notice, but to me it was undeniable. His presence lingered, not just physically but in my mind, long after he had left the room. One evening, as the rest of the family settled upstairs, Ethan and I ended up in the kitchen again, cleaning up after dinner. It had become our unspoken routine, one I found oddly comforting, even as it left me questioning my own feelings. "Here, let me dry those," he said, reaching for the dish I was holding. His hand brushed mine, and I felt a jolt, a warmth that spread through me before I could push it away. "It's fine," I said quickly, my voice faltering slightly. "I've got it." He didn't argue, but the way his gaze lingered told me he had noticed my reaction. "You seem tense tonight," he said softly, leaning against the counter. "Just tired," I replied, focusing on the sink to avoid meeting his eyes. He was quiet for a moment before he spoke again. "You know, you don't always have to do everything on your own. You've always been the strong one, but it's okay to lean on someone else sometimes." His words caught me off guard, and I turned to look at him. His expression was earnest, his blue eyes searching mine as if he wanted me to let him in. "Thanks, Ethan," I said quietly. "But I'm fine. Really." He smiled, but there was something in his gaze that made my chest tighten. "You're not as fine as you want everyone to think," he said, his tone almost teasing but laced with a sincerity that left me speechless. The moment hung between us, heavy with meaning. I felt the walls I had carefully built around myself start to crack, but I quickly pushed the feeling aside, grabbing a towel to dry my hands. "I think we're done here," I said, trying to sound casual. "Thanks for helping." "Anytime," he replied, his voice softer now. As the evening went on, I found myself hyper-aware of his presence. Whether it was the way he leaned just a little closer than necessary when passing me something, or the way his laughter seemed louder and more genuine when we were alone, everything felt charged. And no matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise, I couldn't deny that I felt it too. Later that night, I was curled up on the couch, pretending to read a book, when Ethan walked into the living room. He held a sketchpad in his hands, his expression thoughtful as he sat down on the floor near the couch. "What are you working on?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. He hesitated before showing me the sketchpad. It was a portrait, a rough, unfinished drawing of a woman. Of me. I stared at it, my heart racing. "Ethan, this is beautiful," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I've been working on it for a while," he admitted, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I wasn't sure if I should show it to you." "Why not?" I asked, still staring at the drawing. "Because it might mean something I'm not sure I can explain," he said softly. His words hit me like a thunderclap, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. I looked up at him, his expression a mix of vulnerability and something deeper, something I wasn't sure I was ready to face. "Ethan, we need to," I began, but the words faltered as he reached out, his hand lightly brushing mine. "I know this is complicated," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of his words. "But I can't ignore how I feel. And I don't think you can either." His confession left me reeling. I wanted to tell him to stop, to draw a line that couldn't be crossed, but the truth was, I didn't want him to stop. The tension that had been building between us for weeks had finally come to a head, and I was powerless to resist it. "I don't know what to say," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Just tell me the truth," he said quietly. "Tell me if you feel it too." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, I looked at him, my heart pounding as I realized I couldn't deny it any longer. Whatever this was, this connection, this pull, it was real. And it terrified me. Without thinking, I reached out, my hand brushing against his. The touch was electric, sending a shiver down my spine. "Ethan, this is wrong," I said finally, but even as the words left my lips, I knew they lacked conviction. "Then tell me to stop," he said simply, his gaze unwavering. I stared at him, my mind a whirlwind of conflict and desire. And for the first time, I couldn't bring myself to say no. The house was quiet. The faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound as Ethan and I sat across from each other in the living room. The unspoken tension between us had reached a boiling point, an invisible thread pulling us closer despite the voices in my head screaming to pull away. Every small movement, every glance, felt loaded with a meaning neither of us dared to voice. "Ethan," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. This can't happen." His gaze locked on mine, unyielding. "Why not?" "Because it's not right," I replied, though my voice lacked the strength I had hoped for. Because it just isn't." "But it feels right," he countered, his voice steady. "You can't tell me you don't feel it too. I see it in the way you look at me, the way you hesitate when we're alone. You're just as scared as I am." His words cut through me, exposing the feelings I had tried so hard to bury. I wanted to deny it, to push him away and restore the balance we had disrupted, but the truth was written all over my face. I couldn't lie, not to him and not to myself. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice trembling. "This is so wrong, Ethan. You're my nephew. And you're my aunt," he said softly, his eyes searching mine. "But that doesn't change how I feel. It doesn't change the connection we have." I closed my eyes, trying to steady the whirlwind of emotions inside me. "Ethan, there are lines that shouldn't be crossed." "Then tell me you don't feel the same," he said quietly. "If you don't, I'll walk away. I'll pretend this never happened. But if you do, if you feel even a fraction of what I feel..." His voice trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished. I opened my eyes, meeting his gaze once again. The vulnerability in his expression, the quiet desperation in his voice, broke something inside me. "I don't know how to stop this," I whispered, the words slipping out before I could stop them. He moved closer, his hand reaching for mine. "We don't have to," he said softly. My heart pounded in my chest as his words hung between us. The rational part of my mind screamed for me to end this, to draw a line that couldn't be crossed. But the part of me that had been yearning for connection, for understanding, couldn't resist the pull. Without thinking, I closed the distance between us, my lips brushing against his in a hesitant, uncertain kiss. The world seemed to stop in that moment, the weight of everything else fading away as I surrendered to the emotions I had been fighting for so long. When we pulled away, I could see the same mixture of fear and longing in his eyes that I felt in my own. "This is insane," I whispered, my voice shaky. "Maybe it is," he said, his gaze steady. "But it's real." We sat there for what felt like an eternity, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words. And then, as if drawn by an invisible force, we were kissing again, this time with a fervor that left no room for doubt or hesitation. The hours that followed were a blur of whispered words and quiet touches, each moment more intense than the last. We moved carefully, both of us aware of the line we were crossing, but unable to resist the pull of each other's presence. It was reckless and dangerous, but in that moment, it felt like the only thing that made sense. As the first rays of dawn filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow over the room, reality began to creep back in. The weight of what we had done settled over me like a heavy blanket, the enormity of the situation crashing down around us. Ethan sat beside me on the couch, his expression thoughtful as he stared at the floor. Neither of us spoke at first, the silence between us almost deafening. "I should go," he said finally, his voice quiet. I nodded, though the thought of him leaving sent a pang of sadness through me. "It's probably for the best," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He turned to me, his eyes filled with a mix of regret and longing. "I don't regret it," he said softly. I don't know what happens now." His honesty was both comforting and unsettling, a reflection of my own conflicted feelings. "Neither do I," admitted, my voice trembling. He stood, hesitating for a moment before leaning down to press a soft kiss to my forehead. "Goodbye, Aunt Claire," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "Goodbye, Ethan," I replied, watching as he walked away. The sound of the door clicking shut behind him felt like the final punctuation mark on a chapter one wasn't ready to close. The rest of the day passed in a haze, the memories of the night before playing on an endless loop in my mind. I tried to focus on the mundane tasks of the day, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the weight of what had happened. When my phone buzzed later that evening, I wasn't surprised to see Ethan's name on the screen. His message was simple: "Can we talk?" I hesitated for a long moment before replying. "When and where?" We met at a quiet coffee shop on the outskirts of town, far from the prying eyes of anyone who might know us. Ethan was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with a cup of coffee in front of him. "Thanks for meeting me," he said as I sat down. I nodded, my heart racing as I tried to find the right words. "Ethan, what happened between us, it can't happen again." "I know," he said quickly. "I'm not here to ask for that. I I needed to tell you how much you mean to me. His words caught me off guard, and I felt a lump form in my throat. Ethan, you mean a lot to me too, I said softly. But we need to move forward. We need to put this behind us. He nodded, his gaze dropping to the table. I know. And I'm sorry for everything. I didn't know how to deal with it. Neither did I admitted. But we need to focus on rebuilding our relationship in a way that's healthy. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with sadness but also understanding. I want that too, he said. The days that followed felt like walking through a fog. The quiet moments of routine, the clinking of dishes, the hum of daily chores, were no longer comforting. Instead, they were oppressive, each task reminding me of the line Ethan and I had crossed and the weight of what it meant. I threw myself into the mundane, hoping to drown out the memories of that night. But no matter how busy I kept myself, the feelings lingered, unresolved and unbearable. Ethan stayed away from the house, his usual visits replaced by short, polite texts. Hope you're doing okay was all he would say, and I'd reply with a simple you too. But the space between us was suffocating, the silence more telling than any words could ever be. One afternoon, as I folded laundry in the dim light of my bedroom, my phone buzzed. Ethan's name flashed across the screen, and my stomach twisted. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, but the thought of leaving things as they were felt unbearable. Can we talk? His message read. I stared at the words, my hands trembling. Part of me wanted to refuse, to cut him off, and create the distance we desperately needed. But another part of me, the part that had been struggling to make sense of it all, knew I needed to see him, to figure out where we went from here. When and where? I typed back, hitting send before I could second-guess myself. We met later that evening at a small park on the edge of town. It was quiet, the only sounds the rustle of leaves in the breeze and the occasional chirp of a bird. Ethan was already there, sitting on a bench beneath a large oak tree. He looked up as I approached, his expression a mix of relief and apprehension. Thanks for coming, he said softly. I nodded, sitting down beside him, but keeping a careful distance. Ethan, I don't know how to do this, I began, my voice trembling. What happened? It can't happen again. I know, he said quickly, his gaze fixed on the ground. I'm not here to ask for that. I need to make things right. His words hit me like a punch to the chest, and I struggled to keep my composure. I don't know if we can, I admitted. What we did, it wasn't just a mistake. It was a betrayal. Of trust, of boundaries, of everything. He looked up then, his blue eyes filled with guilt and sorrow. I know, and I hate myself for putting you in that position. But I don't regret telling you how I feel. I don't know how to move forward. I sighed, my hands twisting in my lap as I tried to find the right words. Ethan, I care about you. I always have. But we need to rebuild our relationship in a way that's safe. Healthy. He nodded, his gaze dropping back to the ground. I want that too. I don't want to lose you, Aunt Claire. You won't, I said firmly, though my voice wavered. But we need to set boundaries. For both our sakes. The conversation ended on a bittersweet note, and as we went our separate ways, I felt a mix of relief and sadness. It wasn't the resolution I had hoped for, but it was a step in the right direction. A step toward healing. In the weeks that followed, Ethan began visiting the house again, though things were different. He was careful around me, his usual ease replaced by a quiet hesitance. I could see the effort he was making, and I tried to do the same, though the memories of that night still lingered, a constant reminder of the line we had crossed. Mark, oblivious as ever, continued his routines without noticing the tension in the house. His presence was a reminder of the life I had built, the life I had risked with one reckless decision. I threw myself into work and family obligations, hoping to create a sense of normalcy, but it was a fragile illusion, one that threatened to shatter at any moment. One evening, as the sun set and the house settled into its usual quiet, Ethan and I found ourselves alone in the living room. The silence between us was heavy, the unspoken weight of everything we'd been through hanging in the air. I've been thinking, he said suddenly, his voice breaking the stillness. About what you said. About boundaries. I looked at him, my heart pounding. And I think you're right, he said, his gaze steady. We need to put the past behind us and focus on rebuilding what we had before everything got complicated. His words brought a wave of relief, but also a pang of sadness. It won't be easy, I said softly. But I think it's the only way. He nodded, a small, almost bittersweet smile on his lips. I know, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes. As the days turned into weeks, the tension between us began to ease. though the memories of that night never fully disappeared. They lingered in the quiet moments, a reminder of the line we had crossed and the consequences we would always carry. But slowly we began to rebuild. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was a step forward. And for now, that was enough. As the weeks turned into months, life began to settle into a new normal. Ethan and I worked hard to rebuild the foundation of our relationship, though it wasn't the same as before. There was a distance between us now, an unspoken understanding that some lines could never be crossed again. It hurt, but it was necessary. Mark remained blissfully unaware of the storm that had passed through our lives. His routine, his distractions, they shielded him from noticing the subtle changes in me. And in some ways, I envied him for that. While he carried on, I was left to wrestle with the weight of my actions, the choices I had made, and the person I had become because of them. One quiet evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of pink and orange, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea. The house was still, the kind of peaceful that used to comfort me, but now felt heavy with reflection. My thoughts inevitably drifted back to Ethan, to the moments we shared that blurred the lines between right and wrong. I realized then how much I had changed. The connection we had, while undeniably real, was built on emotions I hadn't fully understood at the time. Loneliness, vulnerability, the yearning for someone to truly see me. They had clouded my judgment and led me down a path I never thought I'd take. But sitting there, I also realized something else. I wasn't the same person I had been before all this happened. I had learned the hard way that boundaries exist for a reason, that one moment of weakness can unravel a lifetime of trust. And I vowed never to lose sight of that again. Ethan, for his part, seemed to find his own sense of clarity. He threw himself into his studies, into building a life for himself that was full of potential and promise. When he visited the house now, he was careful but kind, our conversations light and filled with a quiet respect for the distance we needed to maintain. It was bittersweet, but it was progress. One afternoon, as I was tidying up the living room, I found one of Ethan's old sketches tucked between the couch cushions. It was the portrait of me he had shown me that night, unfinished and raw. I held it in my hands for a long time, my heart heavy with emotion. But instead of feeling the pain of what we'd lost, I felt a quiet sense of peace. It was a reminder of how far we had come, of the lessons we had learned the hard way. I tucked the sketch away in a drawer, a part of the past I would carry with me but never let define me. It was a symbol of the mistakes I had made, but also of the strength I had found in facing them. And as I closed the drawer, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't expected. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, I looked around the table and felt a flicker of hope. We were all flawed, all trying to navigate the complexities of life and relationships. And while the scars of the past would always remain, they didn't have to dictate the future. I had learned to forgive myself, to see the mistakes not as the end of the story, but as part of the journey. And in forgiving myself, I found the strength to move forward, to rebuild my life, my relationships, and my sense of self. As the laughter of my family filled the room, I whispered a quiet prayer for the strength to keep going, to honor the lessons I had learned, and to never lose sight of what truly mattered. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt at peace. What would you do if you found yourself in my position? Could you move on, or would the weight of what happened hold you back? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I need to hear from you. And don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more stories like this, and stay tuned. You won't believe the twists in the next one.